Hey guys, it's Frazer from M-Wave. In today's video, I'm excited to have Intel's latest 10th gen 10700K with a Z490 motherboard, and I'm going to be building this gaming PC for you guys. I'll try and give you guys some tips and explain some of the build process along the way without this video being too in-depth or exhaustive. I'll list some of the parts used in this build here, and you can also find links for each part in the description below. So the first thing we are going to do is install the CPU into the motherboard. So you want to take the motherboard out of the anti-static bag and place it on top. On the motherboard socket, you'll notice a plastic cap on it. It has an arrow in one corner. You want to make sure to remember which corner this arrow is pointing in. And then you want to gently push down on this metal retention lever and lift it to the side, and then let it come up and just lift it up like so. And then you can take up the bracket, and then you'll expose the socket pins. And you make sure not to touch these pins as they're extremely sensitive and easily damaged. So now we can unpackage the CPU. So you have the CPU in this little plastic container. Just make sure when you open it that you don't touch the contacts on the back because they're very sensitive and you don't want to get oil from your fingers on them. So just hold it on the edges like this. And that's the i7 10700K. So now looking at the top of the CPU, you want to just take note where the arrow is in the corner, and you want to align that arrow with the arrow on the motherboard socket. And then you just place it in. And it should just fall into place. And it shouldn't go anywhere when you wobble around. It should just wobble slightly. But it shouldn't be forced in, and it should just sit there. When that's done, you can just lower this bracket back down and get the retention lever. And you have to put a little bit of force, not a lot of force, but just a slight amount. And you just push it down, and then you click it underneath this little retention bar, and it should just sit in place. And then this cover will just pop off, and you can throw this away, or you can just keep it for future. If you want to resell the board or something, it's useful to put back on. It just protects the pins. This next step involves installing an M2 device and is optional depending on whether you purchased one. If you have an M2 device, then now is a good time to install it. So you want to find the M2 slot on your motherboard. For us, it's right here. If there are multiple slots on your motherboard, just check the motherboard manual to figure out which one to choose. So you want to take the M2 device and gently slide it into the slot. Once it is properly seated, push it down and place the screw back in place. And then you want to get a Phillips PH0 screwdriver and just screw it in. Now we're going to install the RAM onto the motherboard. To install the RAM, make sure to pull back the non-captive tabs on the motherboard. On this motherboard there's two non-captive tabs, but some motherboards just have one non-captive on one side. On this motherboard we want to open up the tabs for the grey slots, the outer slots, and then line up the RAM. You want to make sure there's notch in the RAM. It's not exactly in the center, it's actually offset. It prevents you putting it in incorrectly. You want to make sure that notch lines up with the little notch on the motherboard. And then you just want to push it into place. It should just click in, the tab should just go into the sides, and it should be locked in place. Then just repeat it for the next RAM stick. Typically, it's easiest to install heat sinks like this kind of style outside of the case. However, in this build, I'm going to install an all-in-one water cooler, which looks a little something like this. So I'm going to mount it later when the motherboard is already in the case, as I find that method easier. So now that the motherboard is ready, now is a really good time to prepare the case. So you'll want to unpackage the case, remove both the side panels and the front panel if required. Say for instance, you're going to install 3 fans on the front. In this case, we already have 3 fans installed, so there's no reason for us to go and take off the front panel. So now with the panels removed off of both sides, you want to remove any other accessories or manuals or maybe twist ties to prevent those getting in your way. If you have any additional case fans or lighting to install, now is usually the best time to do so. In our case, we have this one extra ARGB fan, which we're just going to install on the back of the case. So now is a good time to install the motherboard inside the case. First thing you're going to want to do is check all these different standoffs, so make sure they're in the right spot. A lot of motherboards now actually tell you on the case which standoff goes where for which type of motherboard. In this case, we have an ATX, so we make sure that we have a screw in each location that has an A. So once you've done that, you can grab the motherboard and put it inside. This motherboard has an I/O shield attached to it, but some motherboards won't. If yours doesn't have the I/O shield attached to it, you're going to want to install it in the case first before you put the motherboard inside. It's easy for us, we've already got it attached, so we just go inside. When you place the motherboard in, just make sure that all the screws are lining up with the motherboard itself. And then you should just put the motherboard screws in to secure the motherboard in place. If you're unsure which screws to use, check the manual. This manual shows us which screws go in the motherboard. So just place each screw in one by one, and don't tighten up the screws too tight just yet. With all the screws installed, you can just tighten up any of the other ones that you left a bit loose. So now that the motherboard is mounted, it's a good time to connect the case front panel connections and any fan or accessory connections. Now I'm going to install the CPU cooler. One thing to note with CPU coolers is that there are many on the market to choose from, and they all mount differently. However, one thing you want to make sure of in any all-in-one water cooling installation is that you have the fans mounted facing the correct way. In our installation, we mount them to exhaust air out of the top of the case. When mounting to the motherboard, make sure your cooler's contact plate has thermal paste between it and the CPU. For us, this cooler came with it pre-applied. Now the cables are just getting a little bit messy, so I'm just doing a quick bit of cable management just to make it easier in the future. So now at this point, we're going to mount the power supply. So just grab the power supply and unpack it. So if your power supply is modular, like this one here, you want to only connect the cables that you need to power the components inside the computer. If you have any other extra cables, you don't need to actually connect them to the power supply. You can just store them and use them in the future if required. Say you get, 2 graphics cards, and you might need to plug in a new PCI Express power. In most modern cases, there's a vent at the bottom for the power supply to breathe and bring air inside. With the power supply installed, you want to run all the cables to the required locations and plug them in. It's also a good idea to pre-route the GPU cables so that when you connect the graphics card, it's easy to power. Now that the build is almost complete, it's a good time to install our storage devices. For example, I have this 3.5-inch 2 terabyte hard drive. This is all I want to install in this build, so it's pretty straightforward. A lot of cases, the way that hard drives are installed changes, but this is a really common method on this case. So on the back, we have our drive base, and you just pop it out like this. And it's a toolless design. You just press this push button, open it up, and then you pop the hard drive in, and then just close it. Just click shut, and then you just slide it back inside. And that's it, locked in place. All you need to do then is plug in SATA power and a SATA data cable, and this other end goes to the motherboard so you can pop it through the grommet. Just here, in case you're not sure, on the front here is where the SATA ports are. And if you're not sure which ones to occupy for the storage devices you have, you should just check the motherboard manual and it'll tell you which ports to use for which kind of storage scenario you have. Now we're just about at the end of the build, but for us gamers, we've saved the best for last, the graphics card. This is probably going to be the most expensive component in most people's PCs if they're a gamer. So you want to unpack the graphics card. Make sure when you place it back down, you just put it on top of the bag. It'll just keep it from getting any kind of static electricity which could damage the components. You'll notice that there's these little plastic inserts on the I/O ports, so you just remove all of those. They're just there to protect them when they're not being used. And also on the PCI Express connection itself, just remove that as well. So with the graphics card prepared, you just want to take the build and identify the PCI Express lane that you're going to install the graphics card. For us, it's this metal coated one here. There's this little lock here that's probably already pre-locked. Just push on it to unlock it so that you can put the graphics card inside. You'll notice there's two plates that correspond with this slot. There'll be one that's opposite it, and then there'll be one just below. Because this is a double slot graphics card, you want to remove that slot that corresponds with the lane and one below. So now with that opened up, you can just grab the graphics card, and you just need to very carefully line it up with the lane. When it's lined up, you can just give it a gentle push to make sure it goes in properly. When it's sitting in place, it will be very obvious, it will feel correct. You can just use the screws that you took out when you removed these plates from before. That's the graphics card installed in place. You just need to make sure that you connect PCI Express power if you have any. This card has a 6-pin and an 8-pin. Because we already pre-routed the cable, we just need to simply plug it in. And with the graphics card successfully mounted, the PC build is complete. So that's all from me for now, but make sure to stay tuned for the next video because we will be performing some gaming benchmarks on this new PC. If you have any questions about the content in the video, feel free to ask them in the comments below. And as always, I'll see you guys again in the next video.